Winston Churchill and David Lloyd George were allies and rivals in turbulent times.
The liberal government in which they served faced huge challenges,
not least the abiding issue of home rule for Ireland.
before a crisis in Europe changed everything.
Join us to explore the relationship between two remarkable men in a dramatic era.
This is episode 3 of our series on Churchill and Lloyd George, Comrades or Opponents. Welcome to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and with me is Professor Richard Toye, the leek to my daffodil. And today we're discussing a very interesting topic, Winston Churchill and his good buddy David Lloyd George and the First World War.
And before they got to the outbreak of war, their relationship had been put under strain. I mean, I'd say there weren't that many moments when it wasn't under strain. Scandal, the so-called Marconi scandal that erupted in 1912 to 1913.
And what exactly happened? Although for my readers, I want them to know this is the Marconi scandal, not the macaroni scandal, which is significantly more delicious.
Yeah, so essentially, remember, of course, we talked about the importance of technology and how it changed, and the Marconi company was responsible for the development of so-called wireless telegraphy or radio. And really, this is a scandal about government contract. And so it was the fact that sort of the British government was going to extend a contract to the British Marconi company. There was more than one. There was an American Marconi company as well. And the fact is that Lloyd George and Rufus Isaacs, another senior Liberal politician, were accused of corruption because they had bought shares in the American company in the knowledge of this forthcoming contract. Now, it's all a bit murky because they weren't directly profiting from the contract, but although they like to say, well, it's a totally different company, it was also likely that shares in the American company would move up in sympathy with those in the British company. And so it doesn't really do very much credit to Lloyd George. The degree to which he'd broken any formal rules is questionable. And so really the point is that during this scandal, which really does threaten Lloyd George's career, Churchill does stand up for him and sort of back him in public.
Right. I mean, he vigorously backs him in public, but almost out of like the fealty of what he may get in exchange for backing him in public. And also, just as a point of reference, in the age of Trump, this scandal seems a very low bar. I mean, not for nothing.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that practices which possibly quite a lot of politicians might actually have got away with, perhaps because of the degree to which Lloyd George is disliked, get weaponized in this particular context. But frankly, a lot of Lloyd George's behavior does seem genuinely indefensible. And
it's a little suspect, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably go a little bit further than just more than a little suspect. And what the sort of Liberals do with Churchill's help is actually to get Tory politicians, F.E. Smith, who was a brilliant lawyer, and also Edward Carson, a unionist, Northern Irish politician, to act in a libel action because the ministers who were accused, Lloyd George and Isaacs, when somebody says something, makes an accusation against them which is untrue, then they sort of seize on that and successfully sue them for libel. And they do so with the help of lawyers who are also important Conservative politicians. So the fact that Churchill has helped Lloyd George with this is, as you say, something where Churchill is always going to say, but I backed him through thick and thin. And other people will say, well, you did that because you thought that it would be politically useful and you might get some reward in return.
Yeah, I mean, Churchill definitely had no problem using a moral lever, right, to bring Lloyd George into his personal debt. In fact, he was even seen crying during the debate on June 13th. And June 13th, Lloyd George had to defend himself.
Yes, exactly. So Churchill's always doing this emotional performance, one might say, to be a little bit cynical.
Are these crocodile tears, you think?
Well, I mean, I always think that Churchill can work himself up in the moment in order to feel what he needs to feel. So I think he was a genuine tear, but he really would go through a process of devising a speech, persuading himself of the justice of his own case, coming up with great phrases which are going to sort of resonate. And the more he does them, the more convinced of his own rectitude he is, the more, if he's in this case standing up for Lloyd George, the more convinced he is that Lloyd George has been terribly, terribly hard done by, and this is the most important historical event ever. He wants to be seen at the bar of history, I suppose he would have put it, that this is the incredibly significant, dramatic, melodramatic is probably
Yeah.
the right word.
Right. Well, and so despite them coming together, there are still real tensions. Churchill's doing this publicly, right? How he
Yeah.
feels about what's going on is a bit of a question, but there's still real pressure coming from the outside, particularly as they approach the First World War. And one of the places I think you can see this the most is Churchill, now at the Admiralty, as we discussed in the last episode, is asking for what would be an enormous sum for the Navy, which was 50 million pounds for the naval budget. And you could imagine that Lloyd George and others in the cabinet would just be agog at any figure like that.
Yeah, or one could be even more cynical, because you've got to remember Lloyd George's political position, which is that although he'd shifted to the centre or to the right to some extent, a lot of his support came from the more radical, nonconformist Liberal MPs, those who were in what we would call, the Celtic fringes in particular. Sort of Cornwall always used to be a strong Liberal area, Wales, parts of Scotland, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, that the 19th century liberal positions of peace, retrenchment, and reform, saying, well, we don't want to start any wars, we want to keep government expenditure to a minimum. That was actually the left-wing position in a 19th century sense. Reform, as in particularly we want to expand the franchise and include more people in the voting system, right? So that's like Lloyd George's core constituency.
Yeah.
When a minister comes along saying, I want to spend 50 million quid on the Navy, then that is something that's going to offend that constituency massively. And Lloyd George can't just say, oh, sure, here you are, Winston, I found 50 million quid down the back of the sofa. He has got to, I would say, make a stand against it and be very performative of saying, I cannot possibly accept this. This is totally outrageous. You've been captured, as it were, by your department in terms of the Admiralty is obviously going to want high naval spending. And so Lloyd George is giving an interview, not just leaking information, but saying that the spending on arms is being bloated and profligate. And so what happens is that they appear to go to the brink of who is going to resign, will it George or Churchill? They hammer out a compromise where both can say that they've won, and Lloyd George is able to say, well, look, I stood up to this, right?
How much of this do you think was choreographed?
I think that Lloyd George knew exactly what he was doing. He could let Churchill get more and more worked up. Churchill accuses Lloyd George of going back on promises that he's previously made. And so Churchill can have steam coming out of his ears. And Lloyd George knows exactly the right moment, what concession to make, where he can square himself with Churchill. Neither has to resign. And yet Lloyd George's core constituency is not necessarily exactly satisfied, but believing that Lloyd George has acted in good faith.
And then again, this isn't the only thing that's going on. I mean, Ireland is also pressing down both on Churchill and Lloyd George.
Right. And both of them, in the aftermath of the Irish MPs suddenly having more power after 1910,
Right.
they have both been in the foreground of proposing a solution to the Irish problem, which involves partition of Ireland. So the sort of Ulster, the sort of Protestant-dominated part of the North should have its own special arrangements, which of course is ultimately the solution which was arrived at later on and sort of persists through to this day. And so they were in the forefront of trying to find a way out, a compromise solution. But that is not something which makes either of them gets recognition really from the right of politics and the Conservatives, for whom home rule is seen as an existential issue, a fundamental threat to sort of the Constitution and hence to the empire more broadly.
Well, and then they're working on a solution to this problem to Ireland, and Churchill's not doing anybody any favors. There was the Bradford speech in March 1914.
Yeah, it's rather typical of Churchill that he often wants to give speeches which he thinks are going to calm everything down, and it is seen by other people as just putting flame on the fire. And he said, with respect to Ulster, that there are things worse than bloodshed. So, in other words, he's actually saying, hey, if people start dying, it could be worse. We could lose our national honour. That would be worse. Now, to be fair, it has to be said that the Conservatives, scholars often say, they'd flirted with civil war. That the new Conservative leader, Andrew Bonar Law, had said that there was sort of no lengths which Ulster might go, which he wouldn't be prepared to support, which implies that if they start resisting violently, then the Conservatives are going to have their back, right? So let's not say it's either Churchill or Lloyd George who was stirring things. There is a situation, a rhetorical spiral, if you like, which is getting out of control. And there are really people with guns on the ground in Ireland, both sides, that the nationalists and the unionists who want to stay with Britain doing gun running. And so there's a famous, although rather complicated incident called the Curragh Mutiny or the Curragh Incident, again, one of those terminology controversies, where British officers based in Ireland appear to refuse to accept orders, or rather to say that they would be willing to resign. They prefer to resign rather than to have to impose home rule on Ireland if the government were to decide to enforce it. And so what that, in a nutshell, the government is bleeding authority. And so that is the situation where there's really a genuine threat of civil war in Ireland. And British politicians only take their eyes away from that situation with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June of that year.
Well, and as we know, that's fundamentally changes everything, which we'll talk about after the break.
Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Professor Richard Toye. With me is Dr. Warren Dockter, the Asquith to my Campbell Bannerman.
Well done.
So
that was much better.
So Europe in July 1914 was spiraling towards war. And of course, the famous assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June had consequences which spiraled out of control.
Yeah, and what I think is interesting here is in this moment when you might think that Churchill and Lloyd George would have lined up and thought, hey, we need to be on the same page, actually, it starts going the other way.
Yeah, this is absolutely right, because I think if we think about their respective political positions within the Liberal Party, then there were some really important divides between them as well as things that united them. So I don't think that it's totally helpful to think of this in strictly left-right terms. I wouldn't say that Churchill was necessarily the most right-wing person in the Liberal cabinet. Remember, of course, he'd been involved in the social reforms such as national insurance and so on a few years earlier. So he was in some sense socially progressive. But I would say he was probably the most militarist of the people in the cabinet, that he was somebody who there were not any pure pacifists in the cabinet, people who thought that you shouldn't use military force under any circumstances, but there were certainly people who were far, far more skeptical of it than Churchill was. And Churchill was somebody who really enjoyed military spectacle and being, of course, directly involved in military action.
No, that's right. I mean, you can imagine how this is a real difference between Churchill and Lloyd George. So we know how Churchill was feeling in July because he wrote to Clementine, and in the letter he said everything tend towards catastrophe and collapse. I am interested, geared up, and happy. Is it not horrible to be built like that? So you can see him almost reflecting on the fact that like he's excited and he feels weird about it.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. And also, other people feel a bit weird about it as well.
Well, they feel weird about him being excited, I think.
That's what I'm saying, exactly. So this is, I mean, and I think maybe he recognizes that is a problem too, that everybody else is wandering around, gloomy and pessimistic and very anxious. And he can see that this is not necessarily good for his reputation to be the guy who seems very gung-ho. It's like, well, hey, war might not be such a bad thing.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. And what's really he's the guy that's like, no, that's terrible. I'd hate to go to war. I mean, it's real silly. But the seriousness of it is represented and I think reflected on more by Lord Lloyd George, who in early August wrote his wife Margaret with a much more solemn note. And he wrote and he said, I'm moving through a nightmare world these days. And I think what that is illustrative of, Richard, is the complete divergence of how they're approaching the matters of the First World War. Because up until this point, they'd really been morely focused on Ireland than global catastrophe.
Well, that of course is quite right. And I think also Lloyd George is very difficult to read sometimes because he was somebody who was a brilliant negotiator and somebody who was good at bringing different groups of people together. Some try to make them feel that they've got more in common than perhaps they really had, and sort of do deals this way. And I think this is partly it's not when Lloyd George says he's living through a nightmare. I think it's not only about the fear of war itself. It is about being politically wrenched between different considerations. Now, remember that he was the guy who'd opposed the Boer War, and had put himself in personal danger when campaigning against it. And so this meant that his supporters within the government and within the Liberal Party more generally tended to be those who were on the anti-imperialist and anti-militarist wing. Now, at the same time, I think that Lloyd George, remember, we've spoken about his speech of the Agadir crisis in 1911, where he said that Britain shouldn't be treated as though it was of no account in the cabinet of nations. So he's got this sense of Britain as a great power. And
Right.
there is this thinking about why Britain might want to be involved in the First World War, which you'd think, well, what gain would it bring them? If you stand on the sidelines and let Britain and let France and Germany and Russia all sort of slog it out together, that is marginalizing Britain. So it's really he sees a competition between Britain's status, or the status it ought to have, and the natural instincts of his supporters. So I actually think that his position in this is, how do I nuance my position so that I can end up supporting the war without alienating my supporters?
Right, which is a really difficult political strategy to work, right? I mean, so you can see why he feels the way he does. And for Churchill, hitherto they'd been focused on the Irish question, like you say, that had been at the forefront of everyone's mind. I really like that how Churchill described the, I'm going to say, pivot or switch to the crisis in Europe. He described basically like the issues run down. The mists and squalls of Ireland faded as a strange light began immediately to fall and grow upon the map of Europe. And
Yeah.
it's a really poetic way to describe a lens change, I think.
Right, right, right. So they've been in this situation where there's this risk of civil war in Ireland, and that problem uh, that problem doesn't go away. It has to be said. It is going to emerge again in spectacular fashion in 1916 with the Easter Rising. But this is really about how the Westminster politicians shifted their attention. The people in Ireland didn't necessarily say,
No.
"Okay, there's a war, war going on in Europe. Let's just forget about our existing concerns." But it does create this political space, and it is a bit like, one big problem is being blotted out by an even bigger problem.
Right. Well, no, and amidst all this, right, you've got a situation, as you were just pointing out, where Lloyd George is in this really difficult political place. And it's interesting. Asquith noted that Lloyd George was a potential leader of the peace party. I mean, Prime Minister Asquith says on several occasions about how Lloyd George was for peace and that he's more sensible and statesmanlike, and that he reads him in part because of the way you were characterizing him, not as just a pacifist, but as someone who understands the importance of Britain's role in the world and in European affairs and how it has to hold the traditional, I'm going to say, concert of Europe position as the leverage to keep the peace in Europe. But amidst all that, again, you've got Winston Churchill running around buoyant that there might be a war. And
Right.
so this increasingly creates tension, not just for Churchill and Lloyd George themselves as allies, but also inside the cabinet.
Completely. And so let's just kind of run down so that people understand what it was that everybody was arguing about. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on the 28th of July, and then Russia, which was Serbia's ally, mobilized her forces in response, and then Germany, which is allies with Austria-Hungary, mobilizes in turn, ending up going to war with Russia on the 1st of August, and then declares a war on France on the 3rd of August. So the question here is: are the British going to support the French by getting involved? And they don't have a treaty obligation to support France yet. Sir Edward Grey, who is the Foreign Secretary, is saying that if the cabinet takes a non-interventionist policy, so he's just going to stand back, then he's going to resign. And at the same time, there is this big body of non-interventionist opinion. So this is the hideous dilemma which is faced, which is essentially, what do we do to back up the French, if anything? And if you've got to think that people are thinking political terms as well, because it's not just a what do we do in the abstract, it is a question of, is the government going to fall apart one way or the other? So if we stay out, there's going to be the pro-war people will resign. And if you go to war, then the anti-war people might resign, which creates a potentially chaotic situation just at this moment of maximum Europe.
Right. No, I agree. And I have a question for you, Richard, that's just a diplomatic historical question, which is, would not Britain's commitment to France vis-a-vis Russia as a part of the Entente Cordiale, which I guess was signed in 1904, wouldn't that obligate them to defend France? Or is that only maritime?
Well, this brings us to a key point, because it didn't have a formal obligation to go to the war in support of France, but it did have a responsibility to go to war in support of Belgium. And so this is what actually provides, if you like, the solution to the dilemma. Because the Germans decide to attack France via neutral Belgium, where Britain is a guarantor of that neutrality, then this creates a situation where Lloyd George can say, oh, well, this is a question of a small power, defenseless power, although a power with an absolutely massive empire, a brutal empire, one might mention in passing.
Yeah.
But presented as the rights of small nations being violated. And that is something which then supposedly creates a moral obligation on Britain to intervene in a way which otherwise wouldn't have existed. And so that is what actually brings the sort of the different sides together, and there's sort of one or two cabinet resignations in spite of this. But everybody, almost everybody, can agree that defending plucky little Belgium is a sort of admirable cause, which actually gives people an excuse, if you like, for getting involved in this great power conflict, whilst saying, well, we're not doing it for great power reasons. We're doing it because we believe so much in kind of defending the weak.
Right. To quote Jeffrey Lebowski, this aggression will not stand. But the interesting bit here is that also creates a political pretext, as you're sort of alluding to, for Lloyd George to be able to switch his position, right? Because now it's a moral question and not a great power reason, right? It's we have to defend this tiny little Belgium, which is, as you say, operating one of the most brutal colonial empires in Africa, maybe in human history at that time. But that's not how it's framed. Certainly not in the British cabinet. The
Right.
question then, I think, would have arisen about who will publicly make this case, right? Will it be Churchill saying, would you commit yourself to in public to war if Belgium was invaded, whether Belgium asks for protection or not? Like, this is the conversation that's going on between Lloyd George and Churchill.
Yes. And so remember then that Lloyd George has been seen as the potential leader of a peace party within the cabinet. And Asquith, the prime minister, is conveniently, from the point of view of historians, writing passionate letters to a young woman who isn't his wife, called Venetia Stanley. And these all, or many of them at any rate, get preserved, and writes down what is going on in the cabinet amidst all the romance. I mean, there's debate about the exact nature of this relationship. He was certainly telling this young woman lots of stuff which really he shouldn't have been doing, but he's telling that Lloyd George was more sensible and statesmanlike than the more radical people in the cabinet. And I think I would say here that Churchill doesn't really understand like the depths of what Lloyd George is up to. And so Lloyd George needs to be seen as consistent, as being keen for peace, but being very reluctantly brought round to being in favour of war. And so Churchill is sending in notes in the cabinet. This is on 1st of August, in this really critical phase where war is breaking out elsewhere in Europe. And you've got to imagine, for people who don't know how the British cabinet works, you've got about 20 people round a long table with the prime minister at the middle point on one side, and the more important ministers are closer to the center of the table, and people pass each other notes. So this is the 1914 equivalent of surreptitiously texting your mate under the table during the meeting, right? But
Right.
people would actually do it quite openly. They would write something and they would fold the piece of paper up and they'd say, pass this to Fred, or you pass this to Winston, right? So you
Yeah.
take the table. And these notes have been, or some of them at any rate, have been preserved. And so we've got Churchill frantically scribbling to Lloyd George, please God, it is our whole future, comrades or opponents. Like, this is going to be some huge breaking point. Or, I am most profoundly anxious that our long cooperation may not be severed. I implore you to come and bring your mighty aid. I mean, if I text you, next time I'm going to text you, I implore you to bring your mighty aid, will be when I want something.
Yeah. That is what you text me. That's your version of an SOS, is please bring your mighty aid. I just think that this is a really interesting moment between these two, because you can see Churchill's desperate to build this political coalition in the heat of this moment. So this is also August 1st. This is the same meeting where Asquith's writing his girlfriend, which feels to me, by the way, like a security breach.
It is, for
You
sure.
know,
Yeah.
and so, but Churchill decides to basically unilaterally, against the wishes of the cabinet, mobilize the Navy.
I mean, this is something which I suppose brings him a certain amount of kudos later on. And I guess that, thinking about Churchill's political position, that he's somebody who's actually maybe thinking about, it wouldn't be so bad to work with the Conservatives again. How the Conservatives feel about this is a different question, but this action mobilizing the Navy is something which he might well think is going to do him favors with patriotic opinion and will allow him to claim later on that when the test came, the Navy was ready. That this Belgium issue, because the Germans have violated Belgian neutrality on August 4th, Lloyd George admits later on this was a heaven-sent excuse for him to start to mobilize the Liberal Party and the public for supporting the war. And essentially, the British give an ultimatum to the Germans, which, I mean, I think they realistically at the point that they make it is not
Sure.
going to be accepted, but they have to wait for the ultimatum to expire, which it does at 11 p.m. on August the 4th. And at 10:30 p.m., Asquith, Lloyd George, Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, and another minister, Reginald McKenna, they're sitting in silence, waiting for the ultimatum to expire. And as Big Ben strikes 11, this kind of terribly solemn moment where Britain is now going to be at war, in dashes Churchill, radiant, his face bright, to announce that he's sending mobilization telegrams to the fleet. And Lloyd George recalls in retrospect, you could see he was a really happy man. I wondered if this was the state of mind to be in at the opening of such a fearful war.
And I think that's something that we as historians have been arguing about, whether or not he was in such a state of mind ever since.
Okay.
And stay tuned for the next episode where we'll continue to argue about it.
The outbreak of war in Europe would change everything for Churchill and Lloyd George.
One would see his reputation tarnished almost beyond repair.
Other would emerge as a national hero.
Join us as the story of Churchill and Lloyd George continues in episode 4, The Swish of the Torpedo.
And in the meantime, KBO.